Hello. Today's lecture is on social judgments and behaviour, and it's split into three parts. The first is attribution, the second is attitudes, and the third is discussion of pro-social behaviour. So, let's start with attribution. From the attribution session, you'll be able to outline the nature of attribution with regards to social perception, describe and evaluate the major attribution theories, and discuss biases in attribution. So, what is attribution? Attribution is the way that we understand causes of behaviour. We attribute a cause to a behaviour. So, these can help you to understand the attributions for your own behaviour, so why you behaved in a certain way. It can make you consider the attributions for the behaviour of others, so you can understand why other people behave in certain ways. And having this causal explanation allows you to predict future actions, control the likelihood of future actions, and respond appropriately to future actions. So let's do a worked example. Right. If your girlfriend throws her drink over you after you're caught kissing her best friend, attributions for her behaviour will help you to infer that her behaviour was caused by her feelings of anger in response to your actions with her best friend. You'll be able to predict that she'll behave in a similar manner if you kiss her friend again. And you can control the likelihood of angering your girlfriend and having her throw a drink over you by not kissing your friend. You can also respond appropriately by apologising to your girlfriend as you have attributed her behaviour to your own actions. Weiner, in 1985, described 3 dimensions of attribution. The first is locus. Now, there are 2 loci that your attribution can be placed in. The first is internal or dispositional. So, the causes of behaviour are related to dispositional forces, such as personality, attitudes, character, or disposition. So, you are more in control because they are within you. The second is external or situational attribution. So the causes of behaviour are related to situational forces, such as the environment or context. So if we consider your girlfriend throwing a drink over you because you are kissing her friend, then you could consider that to be an external cause of behaviour. She's not throwing a drink over you because of her personality, she's throwing a drink over you because of a force external to her, which was the context. Second, we have controllability. Are causes of behaviour able to be controlled, or are causes of behaviour uncontrollable? Now, in this situation, your girlfriend could theoretically control her behaviour, but because the context, the loci of the attribution is external, it's actually yourself that would have more control over this situation. So whilst, yes, she would have some control over her behaviour, it's the context of the situation that has caused this drink-throwing behaviour. The third dimension of attribution is stability. And again, there are 2 types. Stable, so the causes of behaviour are likely to always happen and behaviour won't change. Or unstable, so causes of behaviour are not always likely to happen and behaviour might change. So that's predictable. So again, if something if the cause of behaviour is your personality is a stable construct. It's not likely to change. You're either extroverted or you're introverted. But if the cause of behaviour is an external event, then that might change should the external event not happen, or should the external event happen but you be in a different mood. So personality is more a stable dimension, whereas mood could be considered an unstable dimension. There was one other property of attribution that's been mentioned, but this wasn't by Weiner. This was by Abramson, Seligman and Teasdale in 1978. and they discussed globality as a dimension of attribution. So, causes of behaviour could be global, meaning that they apply to all aspects of life, or they could be specific, meaning that they only apply to a certain thing or event. So, if you consider that someone might be untrustworthy, then if it's global, they might be untrustworthy in every aspect of their life. So they might steal, they might be unfaithful in a relationship, they might not turn up to work and blame other people for their behaviours. So that would be considered a global attribution. Or it could be more specific. So perhaps someone is generally trustworthy, but they're not faithful in relationships. So that might be more associated with being commitment phobic rather than just generally being an untrustworthy person. Now, attributions are subject to biases and errors. This is because people are motivated tacticians. We try our best to reduce the amount of effort that we put into thinking about things, called our cognitive load. And so we have multiple cognitive strategies available, and they choose the best strategy in terms of personal motives to reduce that cognitive load. So basically, they're trying to make things easy for themselves, and they make mistakes. They are therefore cognitive misers. They use the least complex cognitions possible to produce adaptive behaviours. So we try and put in the least amount of effort into thinking about things while still having a desired outcome. People also adopt heuristics. Heuristics are cognitive shortcuts that we use to make attributions, and this is an easy strategy for finding a cause for behaviour. However, again, these heuristics can have errors a lot of the time. They're satisfactorily accurate most of the time, but they are prone to biases and errors. These are the 4 typical errors and biases in attribution: the false consensus effect, the fundamental attribution error, the actor-observer effect, and the self-serving bias. So let's go through these one at a time. The false consensus effect is where people assume that their behaviour is typical and average. We assume that other people will behave in the same way that we behave. So, for example, I know that I never throw litter on the ground, and so I assume that no one else throws litter on the ground, and I get quite confused when I see lots of litter in a certain place. Which is why when I'm driving down the motorway and I see someone throw rubbish out their car, I'm completely aghast because I have this false consensus effect that no one does that. An explanation for this is similar company. We tend to spend time with people who are similar to us, and so this might lead to the false conclusion that all people are similar to us. I know that if I was walking down the street with my friends and they threw litter on the ground, that I would think less of them. And if they felt so disrespectful towards the environment, then perhaps they weren't really someone that I wanted to hang around with. So I would therefore remove them from my company. This is a way that you end up with similar company. You do surround yourself with people who display behaviours that you think are acceptable. And so it's unlikely that people who you hang out with are going to have much differing values to yourself. Another explanation is correctness. We believe that the correctness of our opinions is justified by assuming that others would agree with us. So basically, everyone thinks that they're right. Evidence for the false consensus effect comes from research that found that students who agreed to wear a sandwich board around campus believed that 62% of their peers would also agree, whereas students who refused to wear the board believed that 67% of their peers would also refuse. So generally, people just assume that they're right and that everyone else will do the same as them. It is possible to manipulate the false consensus. Research suggests that opinions about behaviour of others can be manipulated by altering the perspective of oneself. For example, participants who are more likely to conspire against others are also more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. However, when people are first asked to recall a time when they helped others, They then rated subsequent conspiracy theories as less believable. So, in this study, the researchers have manipulated the perspective of the participant. The participant thought that they would conspire, and so they assumed that other people would conspire. But when they remembered a time when they did something nice, then they believed that actually maybe other people would be nice as well. Recalling helpful actions made the person feel more moral and therefore less likely to conspire, and they were less likely to believe that others would also conspire against them. The next bias is the fundamental attribution error, also known as correspondence bias. People have a tendency to make internal attributions. So remember, the loci of attributions could be internal or external, and people have a tendency to make internal attributions. We see behaviour as a reflection of a stable underlying personality attribute, and make these attributions even in the presence of external causes. Now, this correspondence bias, or fundamental attribution error, can be explained by the focus of attention. Your attention is on a person rather than on the context of their behaviour. So, of course, you're going to think that the attribution for that person's behaviour is internal, because you're not considering all the things that might influence them. We also have differential forgetting. If someone behaves in a certain way, we remember that person behaving in that way, but we might forget the context that caused them to behave that way. And finally, we have linguistic factors. Terms that people use to describe people and actions tend to be a kind person or a kind action, but we don't tend to call something a kind situation. And so if you're thinking of an attribution for someone's kind behaviour, it's likely that you'll think that they're a kind person, rather than the situation lends itself to someone being kind. Evidence for correspondence bias comes from research that found that participants assume that a speechwriter believes the view presented in the speech, even when they know that the writer has been instructed to write the speech. So, therefore, they ignore the situation and consider the attribution to be internal to the speaker. Research also found that participants maintain these beliefs even when they found out that the speaker had been assigned the topic of the speech. However, critique for the correspondence bias comes from research that suggests that we are only guilty of the correspondence bias for others. When considering ourselves, we rely on situational explanations. The next bias is the actor-observer effect, when you're referring to a single person, or the ultimate attribution error when referring to an outgroup. So basically, this bias is describing the same phenomena, but just whether it's one person or a group of people. This is where people have a tendency to make external attributions for their own behaviour and internal attributions for the behaviour of others. We feel that our own behaviour is due to situations and circumstances. So perhaps I failed a test because the test was really difficult and didn't actually cover the information we learnt in the module. However, my friend failed the test because they didn't study and they're not very clever. Do you see how there I excused my behaviour with situational factors, and I said that my friend failed because of internal factors? So, again, you think that Sally failed the exam because she's lazy, but you might think that you failed the exam because the teacher hates you. That would be the actor-observer effect. Or, you think that people in third world countries, your outgroup, do not recycle because they are ignorant. However, when you fail to recycle, it's because you couldn't find a recycling bin. Again, you're assuming that other people's behaviour is internal, whereas your behaviour is inspired by external events. Explanations for this are perceptual focus. So again, the behaviour of others, people attract more attention than the background, the same as the previous bias. And the behaviour of yourself, you cannot see yourself, and so we focus on the background. So again, we understand that our behaviour is influenced by situational factors because we don't tend to focus on ourselves all the time, but the situation around us. And then there's informational differences. We're aware of all factors when we're evaluating our own behaviour and situation and context that might be attributed to this, but information is limited when you're evaluating the behaviour of others, and therefore you only assume that their behaviour is a direct result of their internal working. Evidence for this comes from analysis of people writing Dear Abby, so agony aunt letters, and how they tend to explain their own behaviour in terms of situational factors, but the behaviour of others in dispositional terms. Critique for the actor-observer effect, or the ultimate attribution error, comes from evidence that suggests that the actor-observer effect only occurs when describing negative behaviour. When explaining positive behaviour, our own behaviour is described in dispositional terms, and the behaviour of others is described in situational terms. Now this moves us on to the next bias, the self-serving bias. People adopt a range of ego-serving biases to enhance and protect their self-esteem. Self-enhancing biases involve internal attributions for success, and self-protecting biases involve external attributions for failure. So, for example, I passed my English test because I'm very, very intelligent and I worked really, really hard. But I failed my maths test because the teacher doesn't like me. Do you see how there I made it someone else's fault that I failed, but it's because of my own hard work that I achieved? Self-serving biases can come hand in hand with self-handicapping. This can be used as an anticipatory self-serving bias. People who anticipate failure may intentionally make public external attributions before the event to form a preemptive excuse. So, for example, if I feel that I'm going to fail an exam, on my way to the exam I might tell my friends that I got no sleep last night and I don't feel very well. Then, when I don't do very well on the test, I can say to that friend that, you see, I was ill and I was tired. So this has given me a preemptive excuse by self-handicapping in the presence of others. Explanations for self-serving bias are ego protection and enhancement, so the genuine need to protect and enhance one's self-esteem. If we always took the blame for all of our failures personally, then we would have quite low self-esteem perhaps. And the second is impressions on others. Biases are not really believed, but they're used to make a favourable impression on others. So whilst you actually might be quite aware that you failed a test because you didn't really study, you don't really want your friends to think that you didn't study and you didn't try very hard, so you're trying to make a good impression on them. Now, evidence for this comes from students who are receiving a good grade attribute it to their own hard work and intelligence, but students receiving a poor grade attribute it to bad luck or a bad lecturer. Now, it's time for you to pause this lecture and take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll discuss attitudes. Welcome back. Now that we've discussed attributions, we're moving on to attitudes. In this session, we'll be able to outline the concept of attitudes, discuss the function of attitudes, describe and evaluate the formation and maintenance of attitudes, and describe and evaluate the relationship between attitudes and behaviour. So what is an attitude? Attitudes are generally positive or negative reactions towards a particular person, event, situation, etc. And the study of attitudes has been particularly popular. The concept of attitudes is probably the most distinctive and indispensable in social psychology, because of course social psychology is exploring your attitude towards other people, your attitude to groups, your attitude to politics and structures. And so social psychology basically is the study of attitudes. The scientific study of attitudes waned slightly in the 1970s, but returned with full force in the 1990s as we applied the information processing approach to attitudes, so a more cognitive approach to attitudes. This is where cognitive shortcuts come in. Attitudes can serve as a cognitive shortcut. So remember our biases and heuristics. These are also cognitive shortcuts. So attitudes can save time and energy by using established thought patterns about events, helping out us cognitive misers. They also have an object appraisal function. Attitudes can help us to appraise something in terms of potential personal gain and loss for the individual. It's essential to be able to determine whether we should approach or avoid an object, and so having a preset attitude helps us to appraise these objects in advance, rather than deciding every single time you come into contact with anything whether or not you like it. So for example, I love dogs. I pretty much love all dogs. It would take a lot for me to dislike a dog. So it saves me time having this attitude, because when I see a dog, I know that I like it. I know that I can maybe approach it. I know not to run away. However, if I didn't have this attitude, if we didn't have attitudes, I wouldn't know how to behave. I wouldn't know if I liked dogs, if I didn't like dogs, and I'd have to appraise every single dog that I came into contact with, rather than simply knowing that dogs are good. Attitudes also have utilitarian functions. Attitudes can help us to appraise something in terms of their advantages and disadvantages for society. It's important for a cohesive society that we all hold similar values and attributes about important issues relating to our lives. Now, as you can see, the absence of all having the same attitudes can be quite disastrous, and this is where we see a lot of political and social tensions. However, if we all had the same attitudes, things would run a lot smoother. A further function of attitudes is the value expressive functions. So attitudes help to define you as an individual. Your personal beliefs and values help to make you, you. So, although you are more than just a sum of your parts, some of your parts are attitudes and your internal values. The final function of attitudes is the ego defense function. Attitudes can help us to defend our own self-esteem. We can use attitudes about others to improve feelings about ourselves. So, for example, if we dislike one person for one reason, that helps us to promote our own self-esteem, because we don't dislike ourselves because we don't have that reason to dislike ourselves. So, how do we form and maintain attitudes? Attitudes are learned and maintained as part of the socialization process as a result of direct experience and interacting with others. So the first way to form and maintain an attitude that we're going to discuss is the mere exposure effect. This is where repeated exposure to something will increase our attraction to an object. People report increased liking for photographs of people after repeat exposure, although this did level off after about 10 exposures. And I'm sure that you can understand some personal examples when this has happened to you. For example, a few years ago, it was all the rage to wear glitter on your face when you were at festivals, and I think it still is now, but you used to wear glitter on your face in clubs, on nights out, and I thought that was a bit daft. I thought that it was a really easy way to get an eye infection. However, all my friends did it all the time, and so I was exposed to it loads and loads, and as a result of that, and my friends kind of putting glitter on my face for me, I changed my attitude, and I eventually did find it really fun. But this wouldn't have happened without the mere exposure. The second way that you might form and maintain an attitude is classical conditioning. So repeated associations between a neutral and an evocative stimulus cause the neutral stimulus to trigger similar attitudes as the evocative stimulus. So basically, things are liked less if they're paired with negative things. Research found that people were more likely to be persuaded, more easily persuaded, if they were given a nice drink whilst reading a persuasive message. And again, I invite you guys to think about times that this might have happened to you. A time that this has happened to me, for example, was once I was very ill and in hospital. I hurt my leg and I had to be in hospital for a week or so, and it was very miserable. but the song The Greatest Day had just been released from Take That, and back then the hospitals didn't really have much on the television. You had to pay like £10 a day to watch TV, and so they had the radio on all the time. Now, I listened to the song The Greatest Day by Take That probably 50 times while I was in hospital. Then I associated that with the pain in my leg, the boredom and the loneliness. And so now I really don't like that song because I've conditioned myself to associate that with that negative time. Another way that you might form and maintain an attitude is through operant conditioning. Attitudes that are reinforced are more likely to be repeated. For example, responses to an attitude survey had been influenced by an unrelated previous telephone conversation in which certain opinions had been rewarded with the word good. So, again, if you are rewarded for displaying a certain attitude, you might do that again. Say you meet someone who you think is very attractive and you want to make a good impression of them, and you mention that you like a certain rock band, and then they are really interested and excited because you've mentioned that you like that rock band. Now, this would reinforce that behaviour, and so you might then go and, well, say that you like that rock band, but perhaps also listen to that band more. You would associate that and them with this pleasant interaction. Another way to maintain an attitude is through modelling. So attitudes that are observed in others will be copied or imitated, and this is how we see children displaying attitudes that their parents display. Children demonstrate negative attitudes towards certain ethnic groups, despite not being able to give any factual information about the group. But their parents were found to be racist, and so we can see how they are displaying those same racist attitudes as their parents. Now we're moving on to parents. So parents are involved in classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and modelling. So they have an enormous impact on the development of attitudes. And many young people will show the same attitude as their parents, but then they will directly oppose the attitudes of their parents as they're getting into their teenage years. But then as they grow older, they will slowly revert to these attitudes in adulthood. So parents have a massive influence on your attitudes, whether or not you accept it. There are clear links between parenting behaviour and subsequent adult attitudes. So again, if your parents display one type of attitude, then you are likely to show that as well. Similarly to parents, peers are also very important in attitudes formation. They're also involved in classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and modelling. And many young people will develop similar attitudes to their peers, and this can lead to the formation of certain youth cultures. Peer achievement actually has a greater impact on academic success than raw ability. If you're hanging out with peers who are hardworking and very clever and love school, then you're likely to express those same attitudes. However, if you get in with the bad crowd and don't express these desires and perhaps you rebel against school, then obviously you're reflecting their attitudes. And these behaviours, these friend groups, have a greater impact on your ultimate success. Similarly, we see attitudes formed and supported through the media. So this is highly controversial, but it's clear that the media does influence our attitudes to some degree. Media coverage has helped to shape racial attitudes in the general American public over the last half century. This research was in 2003, however, we can see that Donald Trump is still using advertising to manipulate people's perspectives. And so the media is a very powerful and way of influencing people's attitudes. Right, now that we've covered the ways that we can form and maintain attitudes, now I've got to discuss something a little more complicated. And this is that attitudes and behaviour might not actually be directly related to each other. So there appears to be a big difference between what people say and what people do. Early sociology studies of establishments found that many places in the US claimed they did not serve Chinese customers, but actually did when Chinese customers visited. So this was a classic social psychology study by Lapierre in 1934, and they found that when places demonstrated racist attitudes, when it came to it, they weren't actually turning people away. In fact, there's little link between attitudes about alcohol and attitude consumption. Only 9% of the variability of behaviour can be explained by attitudes. Now, if you display an attitude for thinking that alcohol is bad for you and that you shouldn't drink that much, and actually you intend to stop drinking as much, this can often not actually result in lowered alcohol consumption. Simply wanting to do something doesn't actually mean that we're going to do it. And so what's the point in studying attitudes? Attitudes and behaviour might be indirectly related. The influence of attitudes on behaviour is thought to be mediated by intentions, and there are two models that outline this association. They demonstrate the link between attitude and behaviour, and these are the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behaviour. The theory of reasoned action came first, and this had 3 stages. The first is beliefs. So subjective norm is based on normative beliefs. So what other people feel about a behaviour, other people's attitudes towards the behaviour, and how you feel about the behaviour. The second is intention. So how do you intend to act? Do you want to do that behaviour? Do you want to engage in that behaviour? And then the third is your subsequent behavioural response. So basically, according to the theory of reasoned action, the movement from an attitude to behaviour kind of looks like this. You have an attitude towards an action or behaviour, and then you have the subjective norm, so other people's views towards an action or behaviour. These combine to go into behavioural intention, so your attitude and your assumed attitudes of others go together to inform your behavioural intention. And then your behavioural intention results in your behaviour. Now, evidence for this comes from there being a close link between behavioural intentions and subsequent actions. However, Aston then created the theory of planned behaviour. He extended the theory of reasoned action to incorporate the concept of perceived behavioural control into the belief stage. Perceived behavioural control is based on beliefs about resources and opportunities. So how much can I actually control my own behaviour? And this can influence intention to behave and behaviour itself. So let's see how that would look. So we have our attitudes and subjective norms the same as before, and they work together to influence intention. And then your intention influences your behaviour. However, your perceived behavioural control can affect every aspect individually. So let's say we use the example of alcohol consumption. My attitude towards alcohol consumption is, say, I need to drink less. The subjective norm is perhaps that other people do drink less. And my perceived behavioural control is perhaps that I could drink less. I think that that might be something I'm able to do. And so these influence my intention to drink less, and then my behaviour is that I drink less. However, what if that wasn't the case? What if my perceived behavioural control wasn't positive? So I still had those same attitudes, but because I don't feel able to reduce my drinking behaviour, that influences my intention, and I no longer intend to behave. I no longer intend to reduce my drinking. And so my behaviour is that my drinking does not decrease. So whilst my attitude is that I should decrease my drinking, and the subjective norm is that other people drink less, because I feel like I don't have control over my behaviour, this actually influences my behaviour a lot. Evidence for this comes from perceptions of control over a range of behaviours, such as getting a good night's sleep, taking vitamins, etc., were accurate predictions of both intentions and actions. So what are the applications of attitude theories? Well, the theory of planned behaviour can be applied to health psychology to increase positive health behaviours by encouraging participants to develop a sense of control over their health and well-being. For example, an increased sense of control over health can increase the likelihood of women wearing seatbelts, examining their breasts, and practicing safe sex. So, simply encouraging people to believe that they have control over their actions can ultimately help their behaviour. So what happens if we have an attitude but our behaviour doesn't align with it? Well, then we experience something called cognitive dissonance. Although people might not always say and do the same thing, people do like to feel that their behaviours are consistent with their attitudes. And this discrepancy between an attitude and a behaviour can result in cognitive dissonance. This is an unpleasant state of psychological tension generated by two or more inconsistent cognitions. Basically, two pieces of information don't fit together, and so the individual feels uncomfortable. Let's use the drinking example again. So let's say that I think that I should drink less. I am judgmental about my level of drinking and I think I need to stop. However, I carry on drinking as much, and I'm still drinking quite a few times a week and drinking quite a lot during those occasions. Now, this would probably make me feel possibly shame, guilt, anxiety, and so this could be attributed to this sense of cognitive dissonance. I have two attitudes that don't fit together, and so I need to resolve that. So how does that happen? People seek harmony in their attitudes and behaviour, so they try to reduce cognitive dissonance by changing one or more of the cognitions. You could change your behaviour to fit with your attitude, so I feel guilty and shameful about drinking so much, and so I will change my behaviour to drink less. Or I can change my attitude to fit with my behaviour. I might think, well, you know what, I'm a student, there's time to be sensible when I'm older, that kind of thing. Greater cognitive dissonance will result in greater attempts to either change a behaviour or an attitude. So, an example of attitude theory. Simon does not like his job. This is an attitude. Yet he continues to go to his workplace every day. That's his behaviour. These two cognitions are in conflict and he experiences cognitive dissonance. So he'll change one cognition by either quitting his job, so changing his behaviour, or deciding that he actually likes his job, so changing his attitude. However, this is quite controversial. Evidence suggests that rats lick more at rewards given for hard work than rewards given for easy work. This is similar to finding that humans will value a reward more if they had to work hard to achieve it. Now, with humans, behaviour is explained with reference to cognitive dissonance. So working hard is justified by the belief that the reward is of high value. So if I am exercising really, really hard in order to treat myself to a cookie, I'm going to feel like that cookie is really, really high value. I'm not going to think that I'm ultimately going to dislike it or think that it's not worth it, because otherwise that undermines all of my hard work. So therefore my hard work is justified by the belief that this cookie is of high value to me. However, rat behaviour is explained in simple mechanistic terms. Reward is rated in comparison to the aversive state experienced during work. So harder work makes a subsequent reward appear even better by comparison. So since rat behaviour can be explained in relatively simple terms and without referencing these complex cognitive processes of dissonance and therefore increasing the perceived value of something, then why do we need to resort to complex explanations for humans? After all, humans are just animals. So, let's take another break before we move on to the last part of the lecture, pro-social behaviour. So, let's discuss pro-social behaviour. In this lecture, we will understand what pro-social behaviour is and discuss the barriers to pro-social behaviour, including classical applications and core research. So, what is prosocial behaviour? And why do we put ourselves in harm's way to protect others? Here we have a couple of examples of prosocial behaviour. This Marine accepts the Medal of Honour for falling on a grenade to protect his comrades. And these are some of the 343 firefighters that lost their lives during the 9/11 attacks. These people offered up their lives to help others. But how do we explain that with evolutionary psychology? Typically, we refer to acts that benefit others as being prosocial, helping, or altruistic. However, we must try to operationalise each term, as they're actually very distinct from each other. Prosocial behaviour is a broad category of behaviours, therefore is anything deemed positive by society. It's behaviour that has positive social consequences and contributes to the physical and or psychological well-being of another person. So basically, prosocial behaviour is any behaviour that is positive for society. Eisenberg adds that this is voluntary and has the intention of being of benefit to others. Helping behaviour is a subcategory of prosocial behaviour. This is an intentional act that benefits another being or group. However, not all examples of helping behaviour might not truly be prosocial. For example, a charitable donation for the purpose of looking good might not actually be prosocial at its core, because the intention wasn't to help, it was to make yourself look good. And it's the same if you're helping out your friend at the gym, so that the attractive girls or guys there might see how much better you are, and therefore be more attracted to you. Again, you're helping technically, but it's not necessarily prosocial behaviour. Altruism is a further subcategory of helping behaviour, and this is motivated by the desire to benefit others, but with no personal gain, perhaps even with personal loss. There is in fact an altruism dilemma. We're unsure as to whether or not altruism truly exists. If you feel good when you help others, then can your behaviour truly be considered to be altruistic? Because if you feel good, then you can't consider your behaviour to have no personal benefit at all. So these last few slides have covered what is prosocial behaviour, and it's good to understand what this is, because in this lecture, although we're discussing prosocial behaviour, we want to understand why people help, because a lot of times people don't, and to understand when people don't help, that can actually help to save lives. Now, we'll use the case of Kitty Genovese as an example. Unfortunately, whilst we often do help those in need, we also turn our backs on those who need us most. On March 13th in 1964, Kitty Genovese was walking to her New York home when she was attacked by a man. Kitty was stabbed repeatedly and sexually assaulted over a period of about 30 minutes. On March 27th in 1964, the New York Times prints a front page article by journalist Martin Gansberg. For more than half an hour, 38 respectable law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. Twice the sound of their voices and the sudden glow of their bedroom lights interrupted him and frightened him off. Each time he returned, sought her out, and stabbed her again. Not one person telephoned the police during the assault, and one witness called only after the woman was dead. You can find the full article by clicking the link in the PowerPoint slides for this lecture, which you can find on Moodle. The Kitty Genovese case led to public outcry and debate about the breakdown of moral and social values. The popular hypothesis was that the living conditions in the city divide people and undermine their capacity to empathise with the lives of others. People feel that their living conditions are so bad that they don't empathise with others because they're only focused on themselves. And this isn't helped by this social division of it being an every person for themselves kind of attitude. So, when do people engage in pro-social behaviour and help each other out? First, we shall consider the biological explanations for helping behaviour. There is the possibility that pro-social behaviour has developed due to its evolutionary survival value. Evolutionary social psychologists believe that we may be genetically predisposed to respond with aid to the suffering of others. Sociobiologists believe that when altruism is demonstrated with no obvious benefit, that it's because the benefit is actually genetic, so being helpful to others ultimately increases your chances of survival. Let's take this for example. A small child, Margaret, and her friend Red are sat in the back of a car when it bursts into flames. Red jumps from the car, but sees that Margaret is still inside, so he jumps back into the car and pulls her to safety. Does this support the evolutionary approach? Well, possibly not, because Red is putting himself at risk by jumping back into the car to save Margaret, so therefore this doesn't really make sense. But what if I told you that Red was her dog? So, Red is travelling with Margaret and the car bursts into flames. Red jumps out and is safe, but if Red jumps back into the car, he actually in a way increases his chance of survival because Margaret won't feed him and look after him if she's no longer around. So that actually supports the evolutionary approach. Wilson suggests that self-sacrificing behaviours may be demonstrated because self-sacrifice increases the chances of the species surviving even if the individual perishes. So, in some instances, people can be self-sacrificing, and although this doesn't increase their chance of survival, it might help the survival of the species. But does the Kitty Genovese case cast doubt on the biological perspective? Bernstein et al. In 1994 presented participants with hypothetical situations which involved a choice to help. They manipulated the degree of relatedness, so whether the individual was close kin, for example a brother, or distant kin, for example a second cousin. If the target was healthy, and if it was an everyday situation or a life or death perspective. Now, as we can see, you are more likely to help someone who is sick in an everyday circumstance if they are close kin. However, if it's a life or death circumstance, you're actually more likely to help the healthy person. Now, this is because the perspective is likely to be, well, the sick person is not as likely to ultimately survive and carry on the sort of lineage, whereas the healthy person is. In everyday life, you're more likely to help the sick person because they need your help. If they're distant kin, then you're just as likely to, you're still more likely to help the sick person than the healthy person, but you are quite likely to help them, although it is much reduced compared to everyday kin. And if it is it a life or death situation? Again, you're less likely to help if they're distant kin. And you're still more likely to help if they are healthy. But we can see those differences in kinship whether or not someone is likely to help. So this supports the evolutionary, biological perspective because you're more likely to help someone who will carry on a bloodline, but also you're most likely to carry on someone who will carry on, you're more likely to help someone if they'll carry on your own bloodline. The social explanation as to why people help includes the social exchange theory. So this builds on behaviourist notions related to the human learner. Behaviour is motivated by the desire to maximise rewards and minimise costs. Rewards can be tangible, such as money, intangible, such as social approval, or the removal of aversive states, such as distress. Now, why might you help someone if you are in distress? Surely you're the person that needs help. Well, actually what it's referring to is the negative state relief model. So humans' innate drive to reduce negative mood might be through helping others. So if you hear a child crying, this might make you feel awkward or guilty or sad. And so you help that child because you are feeling the distress. So So this results in a tangible reward for yourself, being the removal of the distress for hearing the child upset. When we expect to engage in alternative mood-enhancing activities, we are less inclined to help. So if you're sat on a train and you can hear a child crying, that might make you feel awkward and sad, so you might go to help the child. However, if your stop's coming up and you're about to get off the train, then you're less inclined to help because the alternative mood-enhancing activity is right there, just getting off the train. Another social explanation as to why people help is normative influence. We often do good things because we feel like we ought to. This can often be attributed to social norms, so social expectations prescribing proper social behaviour. It's normative to help others, so it's considered general social conduct to help people who are in need. Helping others is met with social rewards, so positive affirmations from other people. And not helping people is considered or can be associated with social sanctions. We have a social responsibility norm, and that is that we should freely help those who are in need without regard for future exchanges. The application of this norm, however, can sometimes depend on the cause of the need for help. So someone might be on the floor and in need of assistance. This might be because they are old, they've tripped up and they've hurt themselves. Or it could be because they're a young guy and they're really drunk after a night out. So the application of this social responsibility is entirely dependent on whether or not you attribute their need for help to be internal and their own fault, or external and therefore in need of your. I'm not quite sure why this has appeared above. I guess I've put them to appear at the wrong times. But secondly, we have the reciprocity norm. Now this is that we should help people who help us or who we anticipate would help us. So people might help in response to help received in the past or in anticipation of help in the future. The next model of helping behaviour is the empathy-altruism model. Now, this was considered by Batson in 1991, and they suggested that whether people respond with help depends on how they respond internally, emotionally, to the victim's plight. Pillivin, and Rodin argued that people intervene in an emergency because they find it unpleasantly arousing and seek relief, similar to what we discussed with hearing the crying child on the train. According to this perspective, the specific emotion of empathy is critical, and that's why it's called the empathy-altruism model, because empathy ultimately may lead to altruism. Empathy involves the ability to sense another's experiences, identifying with and experiencing another person's emotions, thoughts, and attitudes. So you display empathy when you see someone on television hurting themselves and you go, ooh, that's a sense of empathy. The experience of empathy can lead people down different paths. If you do not feel empathy, help is given if it is in your interest to do so. So this is the social exchange or norms view. And if you do feel empathy, help is given regardless of self-interests, so even when the costs outweigh the rewards. So depending on whether or not you feel empathy will depend on whether or not you help, or whether or not you help if there is another kind of reward that you can gain from that interaction. Toy and Batson in 1982 manipulated the experience of empathy and the cost of not helping. As you can see, those who experience high empathy are more likely to offer help, whether the situation would have a low cost of not helping or a high cost of not helping. However, people with low empathy are far less likely to help if the cost of not helping is low. High empathizing overrode self-interest for the high empathy group. So, is this evidence of altruism? People who feel empathy engage in pro-social acts motivated by an altruistic concern for the other person's welfare. However, Just as people might engage in help to remove distress, people's actions might be guided by an egoist motivation to experience empathetic joy. So basically, if you really enjoy helping, then perhaps that's not considered altruistic at all. Batson et al. Conducted a study in which participants were told they either would or would not be able to learn about the success of their helpful actions. So they would have to help someone or not help them, but finding out whether or not they would find out the outcome of their helping behaviour might influence whether or not they choose to engage in it. It was actually found that if someone was a high empathizer, that they would be, whether or not they found out the outcome of their helping behaviour, they would still be likely to help. Work by Batson and others consistently shows that the experience of empathy for another person overrides this cost-benefit analysis. So they argue for a pure empathy-motivated altruism. However, other researchers contend whether or not apparently altruism might be motivated by self-interest, for example, feeling good about yourself. And it's not actually possible to disprove this, so the debate continues. So now that we've discussed why people might help, let's consider when people might help. If you're walking alone in a street and the only other person in that street falls down in front of you, what do you do? What if you were in a crowded street and no one helped? Do you think you would still help? Chances are you'd walk straight past. If you were on your own, you'd be more likely to help that person. However, if you're in a crowded street and no one else helps, you'd be more likely to just walk past that person and not help them at all. Again, if you follow this link on the slides uploaded on Moodle, you'll find a social experiment where people did just walk past someone who had fallen and was injured on some steps. Now, Latane and Darley constructed a cognitive model to explain when people help. They were inspired by the tragic death of Kitty Genovese, and they wanted to know what created this barrier to helping behaviour. They created their 5-step cognitive model, detailing the decisions that people must consider before engaging in helping behaviour. If at any point during these 5 steps something might happen, decisions can be made to terminate a helpful response. And these are the 5 steps. First is noticing the event. Of course, you can't help if you don't notice that someone needs help. The second is interpreting it as an emergency. So, identifying whether or not that person does actually need help. Is it urgent and do they need your help? Assuming responsibility. So, are there other people around? Are other people helping? Do they need your help? Are other people ignoring them? You evaluate the potential options, so you could approach and help, you could call for help, you could call an ambulance, or you could walk straight past. And then implementing the decision, so how you actually behave. Latane and Darley ran a series of studies that tested this 5-stage model. They invited male students to a study about their experiences at university. They wanted to see what would happen if the waiting room they were sat in started filling with harmless white smoke. So would they intervene? There were 3 conditions: whether the participant was alone, whether the participant was with 2 strangers who were also participants, or whether the participant was with 2 passive confederates, so fake participants, who were acting for the purpose of the study. So, the participant entered the room either with other participants or with fake participants, and they sat down and waited for the study to start. What they didn't realise was that the study had already started, and slowly the room started to fill with white smoke. When the participant was alone, they helped 75% of the time. They pretty much immediately got help. When they were with 2 strangers, they only helped 38% of the time. And eventually, one or other of those strangers might have intervened as well. But if they were sat with passive confederates who were instructed not to react, the participant only reacted about 10% of the time. So what might that be? For what reason might that be? In strange situations, people look to those around them to decide how to act. But if no one acts, then they also tend not to. They don't want to look silly, for example. Latane and Darley suggested there was an inverse relationship between the number of bystanders and helping in an emergency situation. There are 3 processes that contribute to this effect. The first is the diffusion of responsibility. Now, this is similar to social loafing that we discussed last week. The presence of others provides the opportunity to transfer responsibility. People who are alone are more likely to help a person because they have the sole responsibility for action. However, obviously if there are more people around, this responsibility is diffused. Then there is audience inhibition. Onlookers may make people feel self-conscious about their actions. You don't want to look foolish by overreacting to something that you identify as an emergency that actually isn't one, because you fear social blunders. Fearing social blunders and having this audience inhibition makes people less likely to act in the presence of others. And finally, the social influence. Others provide a model for social action. If they do not act, then you're not inclined to. You don't want to be the odd one out. Audience inhibition plus social influence combines to create pluralistic ignorance. Now, this is when the presence of others who remain inactive or seem unconcerned can dissuade or discourage an individual from intervention, even if they might have felt concerned about the situation. So basically, you don't want to look silly in front of other people, so that's the audience inhibition. Then the social influence is no one else is helping, so this creates pluralistic ignorance. This norm of inactivity has been established, and you don't want to break this social norm. So where do you think that pluralistic ignorance and diffusion of responsibility fit into the 5-step model? Pluralistic ignorance would fall around here, interpreting it as an emergency. If no one else is acting and no one else is interpreting it as an emergency, then if no one else is acting, then no one else is interpreting it as an emergency. So this gets in the way of implementing your decision, because it throws off your path to help. Diffusion of responsibility would fall here in assuming responsibility. If no one else is helping, then you don't want to help either, just in case you've got it wrong. Since its inception, different aspects of the 5-step model have been tested in hundreds of experiments. This is called the bystander effect, basically, where other people don't help because other people are present. Latane and Nieder conducted a meta-analysis and found out that this bystander effect, the presence of others reducing the likelihood to help, is one of the most robust and reliable findings in social psychology. Basically, whenever you study it, you're going to find it, because people are sensitive to the presence of others. However, despite the robustness, discovery of the effect has done little to promote helping behaviour, such as contributing to the development of practical strategies to increase bystander intervention. So, how might this have influenced the Kitty Genovese case? How might the bystander effect have influenced the outcome of the lack of help that we saw in the Kitty Genovese murder? Well, Cherry in 1995 identified a number of key features of the Genovese case, but not all of these were translated into experimental analogues. The number of bystanders was important, but we're also ignoring the cultural norms. This was an attack by a man on a woman, and in the 1960s, domestic violence of men against women was not discussed. So this gender aspect of the Kitty Genovese case hasn't been replicated in research since. The studies also do not examine violence and or gender in a more complex story emerges. So the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator becomes important. Bystanders are more likely to engage in pluralistic ignorance when they don't have the facts of the event. They're more likely to intervene if they think that the victim and the perpetrator are strangers. However, in this case, many of the people thought that they were in a relationship and simply didn't want to intervene because at the time, domestic violence was quite normal. And so, if you go back to the 5-step model of the bystander effect, they might not interpret it as an emergency because domestic violence wasn't discussed and was commonplace, and a lot of people were watching, therefore there was quite the diffusion of responsibility. However, let's also consider the facts of the case. The New York Times article made 3 claims about the Genovese case. 38 people watched the murder, and they watched it unfold for 30 minutes, and nobody intervened. However, the evidence doesn't support this claim. Court proceedings suggest that only 3 people saw Mosley and Genovese together. So, although it was thought that 38 people were watching and they had the ability to watch, only 3 people actually saw Genovese and her murderer together. There were actually 2 separate attacks, so these events didn't unfold over 30 minutes, and only one attack could have been witnessed. And so perhaps people didn't necessarily think that people, or didn't necessarily think that Kitty Genovese was in danger because they only saw one attack. The second attack happened inside, so out of the view of the witnesses. And the fact that nobody intervened, well, that's not actually true. People intervened did intervene during the attacks, but they were ignored. And so, whilst this case is really important and to understand why people don't help is really important, it's actually not a very good example of understanding why people may or may not intervene in cases like this. So thank you very much for listening to the lecture today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll see you next week.